Hello, and thank you for tuning in for Art Break, the Politics of Labor. I'm Arpad Kovac, Assistant Curator in the Department of Photographs at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I'm so glad you're able to join us. Before I continue my short statement on today's topic and introduce the two participants, I wanted to share a couple of housekeeping details. Live captioning has been enabled. In order to turn it off, click the CC button and hide subtitles. Also, feel free to submit questions to our panelists at any time through the Q&A function. We are also recording this conversation and it will be uploaded to the Getty's YouTube channel. This program is an opportunity to gather together and look at art, in this case virtually, and chat with artists, curators, writers, and others about the many intersections of art and big ideas that beg for multiple approaches, various forms of interpretation and analysis. Today, we will think aloud about the topic of labor, its often precarious nature, its seemingly inexhaustible visual representation, and some of the specific signs and symbols that are tied to its representation. Admittedly, this is a monumental topic, one which continues to generate literature and debate like a faucet left running. The goal of this program is to keep some of those discussions in mind, but focus on close looking at images, some familiar and others less so, and share thoughts, approaches, and ideas that present new ways of thinking about the topic at hand. Labor used to be a somewhat unattractive subject for art, but the proximity of work to everyday life, the increasing drive during the 19th century to incorporate the real rather than single-mindedly focusing on the ideal, as my colleague Karen Hellman so eloquently argued in her 2016 exhibition, an accompanying catalog titled Real Ideal, Photography in Mid-19th Century France, began to narrow the gap between work and art. Manual labor, its associations with physical and often political struggles, along with the depictions of tools, uniforms, etc., are perhaps the most telltale signs of an artist's engagement with the subject. As the differentiated realms of work and leisure become obscured in the 21st century, and newspaper articles, at least in the US, have revived policy issues around the minimum wage, unions and worker protections, the future of office work, and the precarious conditions of frontline workers during a global pandemic, I became curious about how our collective understanding of labor has shifted and how these changes have affected our understanding of various examples drawn from the history of art and photography more specifically, like these objects drawn from the Getty Museum's collection. This conversation brings together two people whose respective academic and artistic output have often reflected deeply considered notions of the myriad ways the hierarchies of power and various forms of labor are visualized. I have asked each speaker to select two objects, ideally at least one from the Getty's collection, and speak about how they see these objects relating to the idea of labor. Idure Alonso is Associate Curator of Latin American Art at the Getty Research Institute, where she co-organized the exhibition titled The Metropolis in Latin America, 1830 to 1930. She also co-organized the exhibition Photography from Argentina, 1850 to 2010, Contradiction and Continuity, which was on view at the Getty Museum. Both of these exhibitions opened in 2017 as part of Pacific Standard Time, Los Angeles and Latin America. Rodrigo Valenzuela is an artist and assistant professor of photography in the Department of Art at UCLA. Born in Chile and based in Los Angeles, he works in photography, video, painting, and installation. often constructing scenes for the camera. Much of his work contends with the experience of undocumented immigrants and laborers. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Idure. And so she'll speak a little bit about the works that she selected from the collection.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for the invitation, RP. So I'm going to begin then my presentation with my first choice, with is this photograph that I encountered in an album at the Getty's photography collection several years ago, and I was fascinated by it for several reasons. It's a photograph of two bird cage sellers in Mexico City, created by the French photographer Desiree Charnay in 1858. These types of photographs of sellers were very common in 19th century photography from Latin America. They had their roots in the print production of costumbrismo, the genre that depicted local costumes, and the portrayal of social types well favored by local as well as foreign collectors. Prints, as much as photographs, produce depictions of different typologies of persons, sometimes classifying them according to race. Portraits of enslaved people in Brazil or indigenous people in Peru and Mexico are common. Other times by their professions, such as the different types of vendors, like in this case. What interested me about this image is the fact that, unlike other examples of the same photograph, the one in the Getty album was hand colored. My theory is that these photographs, there are several examples of Mexican types in the album at the Getty, were colored in order to quote unquote clean them, because in contrast to the other more hygienized depictions of types, Charnet's pictures were more realistic portraits. They show quite clearly the despair and poverty of the street vendors in Mexico, and for that reason, they did not have the success the publisher expected and they didn't sell well. Probably with the idea of making the photographs more sellable, in France, this album was assembled in France, several of the Getty images were colored by hand, concealing the grimness and whitening them, thus erasing the indigenous origin of the sitters. The difference is evident when one compares the original photograph of the cage sellers with the colored version. The misery and the precariousness of these street sellers has disappeared. Now we encounter a young, white, less serious couple and an outdoor setting with blue sky and green glass. It's a quite idealized image of the reality that was more in tune with what collectors wanted to see. Next image, please. I encountered this other series of photos by Virginia de Medeiros in a trip to Sao Paulo several years ago. The series is called Fábula de Ollar, or Fabulation of the Gaze. The artist created a photo studio inside two cafeterias destined for homeless people in Fortaleza, in northeastern Brazil. In this case, my idea was to approach the concept of labor by the absence of it, as homeless people are generally thought to be jobless. When the Medeiros photographed the homeless, she asked them, "How would you like to be seen by society?" Then she collaborated with artist Julio Santos, who hand colored the black and white photos, erasing the stereotypical views in the portraits and conferring them with a look that conveyed the ideas put forward in the answers. The responses are always shown next to the photographs with a text. I also wanted to point out to the fact that hand colored portraits were very popular around the 1950s in Latin America, and it's common to find these types of photos in the living rooms of many houses. Therefore, there is a familiar and domestic feel to these images. The difference is that the Medeiros' portraits are very large. They measure almost 4 feet high. This big dimension gives the photographs and the sitters a very important and imposing presence that contrasts with the view we generally have of homeless people as a burden for society. Next image, please. There are some obvious connections between these two photographs. In both cases, the images depict some of the most disadvantaged people in society, and they refer to their way of living. There is also a fine line between what is real and what is imagined or constructed in the photographs. Both use hand colored portraits, But while Charnet's photos are idealized for consumption and become an object of the observer, the photographer, or the collector, in the Medeiros' images, the portrait decided how they wanted to be seen. They didn't just become passive figures, they had an active role in their own representation. Unlike Charnet's images, the Medeiros' photographs were not built from the perspective of the otherness. Quite the contrary, the Medeiros humanized and personalized the sitters. Sorry. We know what they thought from their own words, and we even know their names: Jessica, Marcus, Alexander, Maria, and Andrade. In the Medeiros' work, there is no race cleaning operation. She doesn't change the features nor the color of people's skin. The two photographs are great examples of how photography can be used to express a rather constructed reality. And I now handed it to Rodrigo.
Thank you, Dore. Thank you, Arpad. This is a image that is a kind of great transition for what Idurre was showing. Gabriela Iturbide, Nuestra Señora de las Iguanas, which, when she just made this image, her name, the piece was just Señora de las Iguanas, right? But by putting the R in it, it gives this sense of holiness, or this, which is like in a very similar depiction of the images that Idurre was showing before, right? A little below, like a saint, right? So, and that is something that attracted to me to talk about it. Obviously, the weirdness of the iguanas and the statuesque of the depiction of the working class women, the street seller, right? I have looked for years to Graciela's work because it moves beyond documentary, and it moves beyond ethnographic photography while being that, right? I mean, as RP showing one of the images in his introduction, she was somewhat an apprentice of Alvarez Bravo, right? And I thought, but I think her style differs so. She moved beyond what he could offer, or Paul Strand did during the early century in Mexico, and it's a different of the WPA and the FSA photographers would do. I think her purpose, although these photographers, the Pharmaceutical Administration, in some way, they also were in charge of creating some sort of register documentary, but also creating national identity. I think what is interesting about Graciela is that she, from a personal connection with the subject matter, she's creating a new identity. I think it's like it's an emotional. She gives an emotional dimension to what is to create a national identity mixed with the personal, right? It gives a touch to like, and you can see in books. So I don't know if the Getty has, but like there is a contact sheet of the way that she interacts with the character. She wasn't just interested in portraying this and kind of perpetuating this like iconography of the women selling. She was interested in interacting with the characters, right? Which is lead me to like, it's something I tell my students all the time, that there is no such a thing as innocent art in some way. Mostly when you're dealing with documentary photography, right? You just don't take pictures of people around. And I think she pursue in a very honest way something that I call pastoral poetics, or like, blue collar poetics, in the way that she was searching for the subject matters and preserving cultural heritage, but while creating it, right? Not letting the kind of like tourist mindset that photographers actually have dictating what she sees and how she portrays it. And I think those images became part of the like consciousness that we have, or like Mexican photography. So I think the artist can create this consciousness and this like heritage at the same time that like encountering it, or like at the same time that like coming up with it, right? It's a certain respect and homage to the process of documenting something and to knowing how to document certain people, right? And next slide. Something that in this vein, as like in the connections I saw with the Doris, a selection, then the connections with the Iturbide's photos, there is a religious component in it. It's undeniable that there is like a holiness. I mean, the name of like Our Lady of the Iguanas, right? It is intentional, right? And not when it became less clear in with some more conceptual photography in the way that we could consider Ursula Schultz documentary photography, right? But it's not by chance that these photos are made in Armenia, right? Armenia, which is like the oldest Christian country in the history in the world, right? So there is a religiosity attached to the monumentality, right? Thinking in those terms that where I'm really attracted to the bus stops, where they become these altars or these shrines, these like roadside altars for the working class, where they are literally monuments for waiting, right? They are like, it's a very beautiful sensibility that, and I think both photographers, they do to me what I think any photographer should search for, which is like moving beyond location or moving beyond the subject matter. Where you look at this parking, this bus stop, you're not necessarily thinking about the bus stop. There is a time that moves beyond and after that parking, and right, it's like depicting some era that is like modernism and the Soviet era, and also it's like, but you know that this thing, it is to take people places, right? So like there is something about that play photographs that make you forget about the subject depicted. I think they do the same way that Iturbide's work, where you looking at it, but you're thinking about a million things at the same time. You're thinking about religions, like you're thinking about working class, you're thinking about like the sculptural qualities of the photograph at the same time, that the moment, right? And I think that is something that to me is important to rescue, and something I try to do in my own work. It is thinking about kind of how I can position the viewer in a different mindset. And I think these are, they're alienating images at the same time that they're overly familiar, right? I think in one of our conversations, like probably a year ago, I was talking to RP about the also what the show that you were curating with Uta Barn does, right? I compared the photographs of Uta Barn to like driving in a highway really fast, right? And I think that is the what artworks like Uta and like Bart and Ursula Schultz or the Siletour, that's like they make you be in front of the photos and let your mind race like far away from them. So that was kind of like how I came out with the selection, and what I think like there was like a religious component, but it's a religion that is kind of like a pagan, like a belief on something else. Like, and I think it's like I think it's very important to kind of build that kind of mythology around the photo as a producer of this new mythology. You encounter something and you like you export that physicality of the object that you document into to a different realm that is sometimes unknown until you make the photo. Next slide, please. And you see there is a portraiture in the sculptural elements too, right? There is there is a connection that is not only for the black and white, but there is a loneliness, and there is a sculptural component to both like very common working class projects in some way. Next slide. And this is a sample, but you can see the similar approach in the framing that you have with the hand painting and the works. Again, something that you find in the street, in the way that the bird sellers something that you find a street like a parking lot, like a bus stop, they can get all this potential for political conversation and social conversations. So maybe it's time to like give it to Idurre, or I don't know, like how we proceed from here.
Thank you to both of you for your selections and for your sort of thoughtful reflections. Can we go back one more slide? I just want to sort of pause on this for a second and kind of ask, I'll ask Rodrigo first. I love this idea that you brought to Ursula Schultz-Dornberg's photographs as monuments to waiting. I think these photographs, the series of bus stops that she's made, are kind of an interesting, connect to labor in a really interesting way, because you don't see labor expressly, but you see a symbol that can easily be associated with work, right? With workers sort of waiting to get to their jobs. But I also wonder whether her sort of intense focus on formal qualities in these portraits, or rather photographs, can maybe distance the viewer too much from depiction, from labor, much the same way that maybe Charnay's photograph and his use of color kind of distance the viewer and makes labor more palatable for the viewer. Do either of you have sort of a response to sort of that concern?
I mean, I do. I think I go back and forth to the idea of maybe it's respect in the way that you are traveling through different country, as Ursula Schultz is German and doing some sort of like ethnographic research, and you encounter these things that they are not necessarily, so there is this admiration in some way, monumentality look to it. But also I think despite that the place where it happens, I think bus stops all kind all around the world, they kind of find this meeting place for people that they have different jobs, and then it's a time where there is no kind of like, I mean, post Marcy super cool artists making Whitney program looking stuff. They can talk about that sensibility, right? And I think that is what is interesting to me, is like the sensibility of working class is about like a bunch of random things that are not necessarily working self, right? Is waking up it's waking up before the sun, right? Is waiting waiting in the bus like all the time, and in some way that is like how working class get punished with time. Like that is like the hardest commodity to combine when you are poor and the working class. It's not like, I mean, obviously getting paid very little and have to scramble is like it's a major part, but also that most people that have a low paid job have to live really far from their work. So time, and the time that you spend sunning out, the time that you spend looking through a window in the bus, the time that you spend in the bus waiting for a bus to come, it is a thing that closer to reality, which is a very interesting considering what photography does, which is documenting something that exists. It is that I'm trying to document, as a photographer, trying to document that time that is not there, that is not tangible, but it's just like it gets kind of wasted in the dreams of the working class for like 4 hours a day if you live really far away. I mean, if you have to take the bus from your house to the Getty, it's impossible, right? It's like the security guard. They spend like I'm on like an hour and a half every day getting there, right? So it's like that is 3 hours of like zoning out, not thinking about, or like. So I think how you translate those, and I think that is the time that these photos in the quiet moment, in the thing that there is no people activating the space, allows you to think about the kind of like almost religious reference, like reverence to like these monuments of like waiting. So I think that is where like I read them into that. that distance. The coldness, I think it makes sense in her case.
Yeah, I think that there's also like a sense of decay in this image of Ursula. Um, and I don't know if this is a reference to the failure of socialism, or it goes beyond that, and we're talking about labor specifically here. But what I find very interesting about the image is what Rodrigo is talking about, that it speaks about labor from the absence of seeing the person, and I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, I would. I mean, that's that approach, that mode of thinking or way of thinking about Ursula's work. I find to be incredibly productive and incredibly fascinating, because I think it also kind of resonates with your work, Rodrigo. Right? Like you depict spaces, or you depict constructions that don't expressly depict labor, but they're about these sort of social issues, like labor. And I think a lot of people, when they think of this notion of labor, are more likely to expect a photograph like Lewis Hines' depictions of child labor, 100 years ago, rather than kind of symbols that can also, generate meaning and associations with work and associations with manual labor or any kind of labor, really. I'm very conscious that we have very little time left, and I wanted to maybe get to the next slide to look at some works by Rodrigo.
I mean, just to address like the impossibility of truly depict labor. I mean, this is a kind of interesting examples. I'm always struggling with how to represent these things. It's like, I mean, you have examples like Eugene Smith going crazy trying to document Pittsburgh, right? It's just like just trying to like capture that essence of the working class in the factories, and you can spend years trying to depict that, and there is no way to embody in some way the spleen the kind of like that Baudelaire term of like just feeling the pain of the war, right? It's like kind of like the pathos of like being in the working class, right? I mean, we have a very interesting relationship with labor, because in some way we love money but we hate working, right? So like I think it's like, and then they are both together, so like you assume since a very early age that the job need to suck so much, right? That like in order to make it to be a real job, mostly when you work in the working class, you need to really suck, right? Like it, so like the enjoyment and the capacity to like it's a bodily experience more than like actually a physical activity. It's like most of the time. Again, it's like being tired or like going in the bus, and like the food you eat and like activities. All those things become part of the working class mentality, and in some way, for a lot of these works I was trying to embody, is like, to me, more important is the materials, right? The concrete as to give the feeling of institution. None of us, mostly people that have to deal with institutions, because you have to do paperwork, file unemployment, like file for insurance, like things like that, doesn't come easy when you are in this kind of precarious social positions. You encounter that institutions feel cold, right? It's not just that like just because they're made. So try to get to what is the feeling. Concrete is the only thing that give me the feeling, right? So like I depict these materials made out of concrete in this way that like the barricade in the image on the right, like the cracking and the time passing is only depicted through like the material of the clay. I try to like, a lot of the time, there is not something that you can an object that you can take pictures if you are not like pursuing that feeling, and that feeling a lot of the time gonna come in terms of materials or in terms of temporality, right? How much it feels that something can pass by onto something. It's as Idurre was talking about decay sometimes.
Right. I just want to acknowledge that we're at the 30-minute mark, and we might, continue to chat a little bit longer. And if there are any questions, please write it into the Q&A for either Rodrigo or Idure, and we can certainly address those. Idure, is there anything else that you wanted to kind of mention or bring in?
Well, I just think that, and this is something that I have dealt with my research, is the idea of absence is sometimes more powerful than presence, and so I think that in the work of Rodrigo, it's very clear that, as well as in Ursula's. So I was thinking about that as Rodrigo was talking. And
You
and
know,
in the sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
no, please. No, I don't want to interrupt. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say that it is very clear that society has changed so much in terms of how we look at art. If you compare the 19th century photograph to the contemporary art, and you see what the collectors were looking for, and why that Charney photographs was hand colored. They didn't want to have in their collection, this clear presence of disadvantaged people and their misery, and how it's very interesting to see how that started to change in around the 30s, the 40s on. And anyway, I wanted to point out to that, like how our perception of things have changed throughout the time, and our interest when we look at a photograph.
Yeah, I think Rodrigo's work is sort of a perfect example of embodying this change, right? Of moving past, like you said, Rodrigo, of like expressly trying even to depict the act of labor or the action associated with labor, and focusing more on a feeling, focusing more on those sort of intangible components that are associated with labor. I mean, there's just been such a huge gap, like you mentioned, Idure, between the 19th century and expectations of what labor could mean and its depictions, like the Charney photograph that you selected, but also the Millet painting that was on one of the first slides, where labor really was manual labor. It was sort of exalting the farm worker, and sort of connecting labor to the land in many ways. And it's just it's kind of fascinating just to think of how we've sort of shifted our understanding.
And I also think it's important to point out the connections between labor and race, that also is shown in both my selections, but we could transfer that to many other images from other countries as well. There is a connection.
Completely. And one thing we didn't include in this very short conversation, very short presentation, are images of office spaces and office interiors, and who is represented in those spaces and who is largely absent, right? That goes back to your sort of comment about how race and social status ends up being represented in art. And not that there aren't representations of office spaces within art. There certainly are, but it's very interesting to think about how race sort of comes into play.
I mean, something I wanted to mention before is because you also mentioned Millet painting, right? It's also this that is another thing that's very hard to capture in art, but it's very present and has been since like realist painting, right? Is that the cyclical nature of labor, right? The idea of just those cleansers are like on the way to picking something, right? But it's also showing is different than capturing the decisive moment. It's trying to capture the that is a day in, day out process, right? And I think that is so much part of the working class mentality. At least when I grew up in Chile, it's like trying to get a job that never ends.
Yeah. We have just like 4 minutes left before I think we have to log off. But there is a question directed at Rodrigo. Could you please explain your choice of photogravure or pigment?
The most simple, well, for the project, I really wanted to cap that weight. Again, literally, as the whole body of work was made out of concrete, I wanted to have the paper having that pressure too, right? The second idea behind is that it's handmade, so we're gonna have problems, and there is the repetition. As I was just talking about, the idea of doing it over and over again is gonna be a difference. And I think in that difference, in the flaws, there is the richness of it, right? So, and the third issue with it is that is the earliest form of photographic reproduction that you can encounter. So mass reproduction. So I think there was a lot of elements in the way that I wanted to convey that the pressure of something, in the way that these like images are kind of in solitary confinement. I wanted to feel the pressure onto the paper, and the image made out of that pressure that it feels. That it's kind of like we walk around with it, right? It's like we kind of like, I think in the working class or working poor of blue collar mentality, it's kind of like a pain flanurship, right? Also, like you just walk around with this like weight of some kind, and I think it was very important to represent. And also because I'm moving slowly through the inkjet print in the way that also I think things feel, I want things to feel that they're made by a person. And I think right now the next series that actually talks about post workers. The next show I have in Chile in April is New Words for a Post Worker World. It is they will be old school silver gelatin prints, right? But I think is actually this is a past work that I think is something I wanted to mention about the role of like rosa altars in Latin America, and this called animitas, very popular in Chile. But to me, is trying to like do the mental exercise of how to think about what something looks like in your mind before you document it, right? Like it couldn't have been hard to go to Chile and take pictures of these rosa altars, mostly in the neighborhood where I grew up. But to me, I was thinking very kind of tangibly about like what is the minimum common denominator for somebody to stay in the collective consciousness, how things translate, or what is the physicality that something requires to stay, in the public sphere, on the collective consciousness. So I grab a lot of the elements of the monuments that we know and love and hate, and give them the scale of the monuments that I know from home.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. There's like, we can continue this conversation for so much longer. We kind of run out of time. I want to thank both of you, Rodrigo and Idure, for sort of, just being willing to dive into this topic, this incredibly unwieldy and incredibly monumental topic, and to just look at some pictures together and think aloud. I know there are a lot of questions that we just didn't get to, unfortunately, but hopefully this is a reason to maybe do this again. So I want to thank both of you for your participation, and thank you everyone who tuned in. There's going to be another slide coming up that will give you a sense of some upcoming programming that we have. So
bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.